This is an AQA Psychology GCSE revision video for the Paper 2 topic of Brain and Neuropsychology with a specific focus on Penfield, which is a key study in this unit. So before we begin looking at Penfield's study and the specifics, just a recap and a reminder of how you would structure your description of a study in psychology if you are ever asked to describe the study. But bear in mind that Penfield is a key study, which means you could be asked a 9-mark question where you will have to evaluate the study. We will focus on that in the second part of this video. So beginning looking at Penfield, his study was about something called the interpretive cortex, which is a part of the brain located in the temporal lobe. And it is responsible for storing the interpretations of our memories, so emotions related to the events, how we felt at the time we experienced something. Penfield was particularly interested in epileptic patients. He was working to treat people with epilepsy, and it was believed that in epileptic patients, hallucinations might be caused by the electrical stimulation of the interpretive cortex. So Penfield took that idea and tried to use it to identify the actual role of the interpretive cortex. So as I mentioned, he worked to treat people with epilepsy, but he developed a surgical technique called the Montreal procedure, which was about electrical stimulation in the neurons of the brain. So he conducted a case study in 1959 where he wanted to investigate the psychological responses that participants gave when he electrically stimulated parts of their brain using the Montreal procedure. He had to keep the patients conscious so that they were able to report what they were experiencing, but it was completely painless, so it wasn't unethical in that regard. So looking at the finer details of the aim, method, results and conclusion of Penfield, the aim was to explore the workings of the conscious mind and to look at the psychological responses that patients had when their brain was electrically stimulated. So you only need one of those. You could put explore the workings of the conscious mind, or you could put to describe the psychological responses of individuals when their brain is electrically stimulated. The method was a case study, which is really important to make a note of because in the exam they might ask you to describe Penfield's study and they evaluate the fact that he used a case study. So you will need to know your strengths and weaknesses of case studies. He used the Montreal procedure, which is your key term, which is about electrically stimulating specific neurons. And then he also recorded what happened, how the patient responded, what they said. What he found was that if the visual cortex in the brain was stimulated, then the patient was reported seeing things like colours, shadows and outlines. So one patient, reported seeing balloons floating in the sky. In the somatosensory area, so again thinking about the different parts of the brain and what they're responsible for, the somatosensory area is our perception of senses, etc. So participants reported being touched or a false movement or a feeling of tingling, a tingling sensation. And then in the temporal lobe, which has the auditory area and the interpretive cortex, most importantly, the participants said they felt like they were reliving an event in their life, an episodic memory in their life. They had a very clear and vivid recollection, so being able to see or actually feel like they were back there. So a lot of people likened it to deja vu, so showing that the temporal lobe is the memories of past events and that we store them in terms of the experience and what they mean to us as individuals. And it's the interpretive cortex that stores the feelings. That is what Penfield was able to conclude through his study. So when we think about how we can evaluate Penfield's study, bear in mind I said you need to be able to evaluate the fact that it was a case study. But specifically for Penfield, if you are asked a straightforward evaluating Penfield's study, there are some questions on the screen for you to consider. So I'm going to allow you to pause the video and in 5 seconds we can talk through how to elaborate on some of these evaluation points. Okay, so the first one, the participants were all epileptic and therefore an unusual sample. This means we can't generalise the findings. We don't know if a non-epileptic brain would respond in the same way to the Montreal procedure and report similar feelings or experiences or memories and interpretations. It's just not generalisable. He used a very scientific, precise procedure and stimulated particular areas one at a time. This is a major strength because we need to be scientific in psychology and we need it to gain validity. So we can get very valid findings from the fact that his procedure was so precise, but we can also get really valid findings from the fact that he didn't stimulate lots of different areas at the brain. So it was very clear and it was very obvious what the patients were reporting and in response to which part of the brain being stimulated, the visual cortex, the temporal lobe, or the somatosensory. So that's a very good thing. Furthermore, his study was very useful because it shows how different parts of the brain, the cortex, are responsible for different functions. So previously in the topic, you've looked at localization of brain function, this idea that each part of the brain has a specific function. Now, this study really helps to support that because when Penfield stimulated certain parts of the brain, those functions were evident. For example, the visual cortex was stimulated and participants reported seeing things. So it shows that the visual area of the brain is responsible for visual things. And then lastly, the experiences patients reported were completely different for each individual. This is difficult for researchers because it's very time consuming and hard to analyse. So they have to read through and compare everyone's responses to try and look for common trends, common threads. And the fact that they were all different would make it very hard to generalise those findings. Other things off the screen to evaluate Penfield with, as I say, it was a case study. So this small sample and also them being epileptic means you can't generalise the findings. However, the case study method did allow Penfield to get very detailed findings, and asking the participants to report what they were experiencing allows that in-depth, insightful, useful information. So those are just some ideas of how you can evaluate the fact that Penfield used the case study method. But that concludes the end of this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.